that part of credentialing, how you're going to recognize the lifelong part of learning.
Well, I think we may talk more about this. I think Sydney's keen to try and innovate. We have a pretty radical restructuring of what we're doing institutionally in terms of curriculum, and we want to carry that through into this space. Probably.
Yeah.
I've been doing some work on bilingualism, penalties, which are not penalties at all. It's quite the opposite. The bilingual penalty is a myth.
Yeah. And I think, but again, we may look at the kind of penalties in terms of what you don't have, but we don't see what you actually get through this, being able to look.
Okay, I think we start. I guess, can people hear me?
They should be there, yeah.
Is that okay? If you put your headphones on. We had a problem with the headphone mic, so this is probably going to be slightly clunkier for me, but nevertheless, will work fine. My name is Colm Harmon. I'm
Professor of Economics at the University of Sydney and head of the School of Economics there. And it's my deep and sincere pleasure to welcome you all to this Meet the Author session, because in so many ways, this is an author who's influenced in a very profound way the work of people like me on economics of education. Andreas Schleicher from the OECD is at the forum launching this book on World Class, How to Build a 21st Century School System, which is a free download for everybody. And we assume everybody in this audience has read every word of it before now. And we'll be asking lots and lots of questions from us. I wanted to just kick off the session by sort of almost noting the sort of, and revisiting this point of the kind of influence that Andreas and the team have had. Just looking at the role of something like PISA, it holds a mirror up to governments. It debunks myths and it challenges. It's an extraordinary project, and in many ways it's the essence of what a modern interpretation of what OECD is and can be. As I said, my perspective is driven by my own work on returns to education. And the perplexing question, really, once we've established what returns to education are, is why we still get children who don't value what is the best investment they can make in life. And indeed, by extension, their parents and guardians doing the same thing. So how does this align with the core question of this session on the hallmarks of a 21st century school system? Firstly, as you'll see, and we'll talk about through this session, Andreas shows how so much of the issue rests in myths. I'm working on issues in my own work, such as the bilingual penalty, how children who come from bilingual backgrounds appear to do less well in sort of school performance tests. And reality is, there is no penalty. In fact, it's the opposite. The myth that rich and educated parents have rich and educated kids is also a classic case of confusing causality and correlation. It is a fact that can be broken down. I think the work of PISA and the team at the OECD shows beautifully how lowering class sizes is finally a policy that should be dead and buried. It's very expensive, and because it is, most systems come at it from the cost side rather than from the increasing spending side, meaning teachers teach more and in many ways do less by way of pedagogy. Secondly, much of what we need to do is change the perspective of the future over the present. The best systems need the best pupils, and the skewness towards higher socioeconomic status children in progression to upper secondary and tertiary education is not really suggesting we're finding the talent we need, a very unproductive reality to an economist. Getting these students and their parents to value what education offers is a big challenge. Most education systems meet that challenge of participation as a credit constraint issue. It isn't. It's a time preference issue, valuing the present over the future. That's a much harder issue to solve. And finally, we have to look at what the system itself can deliver. I have a role at my university in helping launch a new curriculum. And what do we stress? We stress experiential. We stress deep focus on core disciplines, but with the space and in certain places compulsion to move into different areas delivering critical skills. We focus on internationalization. Last night I hosted a reception, a real joy to do so, here at the forum of students of Sydney who are in a dual degree program with Sciences Po, someone who may be in the audience here tonight. So stunning students, a program that is designed with many of the hallmarks that Andreas will recognize for the school system. Depth and breadth, but with a scope for individualism. I was speaking later online to a colleague about our event, and she simply noted, the brightest and the cleverest and the most motivated and resilient and resourceful. Isn't that what we're here for? I think that says it all for me. So I'm going to just simply start this session with a simple question to Andreas about the motivation to write this.
Thanks, Colin. In fact, I believe I have an incredibly privileged position at the OECD. I meet policymakers, educators all around the world, learn from them, learn with them, and at some point I felt I should really give something back and put my ideas down. And in fact, not even that idea came from me. It was a British journalist, Sean Coughlin, who basically said, you've got to write this book. And finally, here it is. And I also, before I start, really want to thank my colleagues here, Marilyn Ashwin, who's actually been one of the main drivers of this writing, and also Cassandra Davis coordinate our work, Rebecca Tessier. I mean, they should be credited as much as anyone for getting us this far. And one of the things that I really thought when writing this book is that it's so much easier for us to educate students for our own past than for their future. No? As parents, we are incredibly conservative. No? We like our children to learn what we learn and how we learn. No? It's very hard for us to accept that our children learn things that we didn't learn. Or even more, that our children no longer learn things that we thought were so incredibly important for us. Teachers are much more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. No? And if you're a policymaker, it's so much easier to lose an election over education than to win one, because if you do something great, it's going to take years and years and election cycles to see the fruits of that. So it's actually what makes our education systems very, very conservative social systems.
On top of that,
sometimes
there's the morbidity.
moving education,
there are limbs
particularly
lost.
school
There's
systems,
time
is
spent
perhaps
in
the
the
most
hospital.
conservative part.
There's illness and impact upon families. So the impact today is profound, although not quite at those levels.
So let me just
but I think
let's just
that
pause
it's
for 1 second.
incumbent upon us to
While our
act
team-
now
We're getting
and to
cross
raise
feedback
the will
again?
to act
Okay.
now so that we never hit
So you're hearing
that
the other
dire
session.
forecast.
Wow. Okay. That's
You get
actually
the
a
benefit
test.
of two.
It's a cognition test. It's the secret one that the OECD
Yeah.
have been developing.
Let us know when
Okay.
it's working now.
We're back
Yeah.
again. Andreas.
At some points, I thought like changing education is like, moving a graveyard. You cannot rely on the people out there to help you in moving things. And the biggest risk for education these days is not that schooling is not terribly efficient. We know that since a long time. It's that schooling loses its relevance. The kind of things that are easy to teach have become easy to digitize, to automate. In the end, sort of artificial intelligence these days pushes us really, really hard to think about, what makes us human? What are the human qualities that we can pair with the artificial intelligence of computers to actually change the world for the better, and then how we can develop them, how we can actually produce those skills. When you could still assume that what you learn in school is going to last for your lifetime, and when you could still assume that you prepare your teachers once for working life, we lived in a very different world. Education was about consumption. Today, it's about agency. Can you change the world? Can you think out of the box? Can you actually sort of develop a kind of compass and navigation tools that helps you find your own way in a world that gives you less and less orientation from the outside? In the past, when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust the answer to be true. Today, you look up something on Google and you find, 40,000 answers to your question. Nobody tells you what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. It's a very, very different kind of set of skills. And the challenge today is not just to learn, but to constantly unlearn and relearn things when the world is changing. And it's actually really harder than learning. When we grow comfortable with certain ways of thinking, with certain ways of, working, and suddenly those things lose relevance. Can we actually anticipate those moments and then change and evolve? I think that's really, really hard for us to do this. And that's where the kind of model of schooling that is still prevalent is getting to its limits. You can see we educate students in batches when they reach a certain age. We put them to a certain school. We educate them all in the same way. When I started my career, actually, I didn't work in education. I worked in medical research. And what you do as a doctor is first you take somebody's temperature, you see what's wrong, then you try to find out, what can I do for you, what kind of medicine can I give you to make you healthy again. But in education, we sort of start out by giving everybody the same medicine, and then when they graduate, we try to figure out, did it actually work? And that's too late. We have to sort of change that kind of model. And one of the reasons I asked myself when writing the book was actually, what holds us back in our thinking apart from the inherent conservatism? And I actually found a lot of myths, things that we believe that are actually not borne out by evidence. And the great thing at the OECD is actually we can produce that hard data, hard evidence. I give you a couple of examples. The poor will always do badly in school. That's not true. What we found is that the 10% most disadvantaged school children in Shanghai, in China, did as well as the 10% wealthiest Americans on mathematics. So we can overcome poverty. Some people say, oh, it's the immigrants who draw down the PISA scores. Our system doesn't do well because we are flooded by kind of people from the outside. It's not true. There's no relationship between the share of immigrants in a country and the performance of its education system. Actually, you're a great example, Australia. But there are others too. In fact, what we found is that the country where you go to school makes a lot of more difference than the country where you came from. Take another thing, smaller classes are always better. That's not true. Actually, most of the high-performing education systems that we studied actually show that, whenever they have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they go for the better teacher. In fact, the smaller classes often drive the tailoristic work organization from which our education systems suffer. What does it mean? If you don't spend more money, you want to make a class smaller, you ask your teachers to teach more, one lesson after the other. The highest performing education system I really found out do things very differently. They ask their teachers to teach for a certain number of hours, but they give them plenty of time to work with their colleagues, to frame good practice, to work with individual students, to work with parents. They take a much more holistic engagement with students and their competencies. They think much more about, behavior of students and the broader social and emotional development of students than the teacher who just has to run from one math classroom to the next. So smaller classes have a price. We can discover this today. Or, more time spent learning will always mean better results. No? It's very sort of seductive to believe that. Well, Finland teaches a little more than half the time that students in the United Arab Emirates learn. But in Finland, they learn a lot in very little time, and in the United Arab Emirates, they learn very little in a lot of time. So it's how we use the time. That's what makes the difference. Or even the hardest part is culture. And there's still many people around who think, well, education is an outcome of culture, and it's very, very hard. But what I actually found is that often we create culture by what we do rather than inherit it from the past. And the way we could demonstrate this is, when you look at the countries that improved very rapidly on our assessment, like Portugal in Europe, or Brazil in South America, or many countries that have really seen remarkable progress, or Vietnam or China. They didn't change their culture. They changed what they do in education policy and practice. And that brought me to the next question, what can we actually do? And in fact, Con, one of the points that you made is exactly what struck me first. When you look at high-performing education systems, they make different choices between the future and the present. Chinese parents are going to invest their last time, their last resources in the future of their country, and that's the education of their children. In Europe, we have already spent the money of our children for our consumption today. That's why we are so heavily in debt. And that's a choice that societies make, and I think a very, very important choice. How do we value tomorrow versus today? But value in education is only part of the equation. The other thing we found is actually high-performing systems have this deep belief that every child can learn, every student can learn. And now you say, well, everybody believes it, but do we? Many of our education systems are highly stratified and tracked. No? We try to figure out what you're good for, then we put you in a special school, and you're going to be developed, or you're not. And that's the kind of tracking and streaming that we found is actually counterproductive. It creates the mentality that learning is a product of, inherited intelligence or talent or so. And students actually believe that. In systems that are highly stratified, I found that actually many of the young children believe that, learning is a matter of, intelligence. So why would I invest to study hard when I don't think I can change it? In education systems that are open, that open doors to you every day, students are much more likely to believe that, if I study really hard, I'm going to be successful because my teacher is going to help me. So these beliefs, the belief in every student's capacity to learn and to learn differently. And my role as a teacher to find out how do students learn and cater for that. Really, really important. You can see that Finland, Japan, Estonia, they have moved from sorting human talent, now that was the industrial model, to developing human talent. Actually, it's a really important transition. And then, of course, nowhere does the quality of education exceed the quality of teachers. Now everybody thought, that's to do with how we pay our teachers. And I agree that's terribly important. But what I actually found is that the challenge is actually more to make teaching intellectually more attractive, not just financially more attractive, to create a kind of environment in which teachers can, work together to frame good practice, in which they are not the recipients and the transmitters of prefabricated knowledge, but where they are the producers of creative. And I find amazing examples. And last but not least, it's about moving from the kind of administrative accountability and bureaucratic organization of education. We have one person at the top who thinks, what everybody should be learning, and then lots of people delivering this. That's the factory model, which used to be terribly efficient and effective in the industrial age, but which no longer serves us. Today, we need the kind of professional work organization, and we have that. We found really plenty of really good examples where you can really do this, and where you can actually ensure that every student benefits from excellent education. But the last part is the toughest part. We know a lot, but actually it's so hard to put this into practice. In fact, the road of educational reform is littered with good ideas that were poorly implemented. We find that it's really the implementation of good ideas really, really hard. And that's why I learned a lot in my work at the OECD, working with policymakers over many years. This is what they tried, this is the barriers they run into, this is why they give up, this is how they retry it again. I devote a large part of my book to this, and actually the one thing that struck me most is that the kind of things that we tend to focus most on, the structures, the processes, the kind of organization, that's just, the tiny tip of a large iceberg. The kind of things that we can see that, as a policymaker, you can work on class sizes, working times, organization, tracking, and so on. But there is, 90% of the education system is under the waterline, and these are the motivations of people, the fears of people, the beliefs of people, the myths by which they are captured. And actually, high-performing education systems have become really, really good in bringing people along. One of the things you can see everywhere is where you don't engage teachers and practitioners in the design of education reform, they're never going to help you with implementation. And that's true everywhere in life. But we're not really good at that. We're still focusing on this kind of top layer and not on the 90% that is under. And that's basically, building a shared understanding of why change is important, what change is needed, and bringing people along is one of the things I observed in the systems that have really seen not just incremental change or institutional change. Every education system has amazing schools. It's not very difficult. But the test of truth is, can you make success systemic? And there are just very few countries that can do this. And that brings us also what we can learn from each other. There is in education a deep belief that education is sort of inward-looking. It's a matter of more in art than in science. It's not really easily possible to learn from other experiences. In fact, our data and our studies actually show that there's so much that we can learn from each other. As a teacher from the neighboring teacher, the school from the neighboring school, and as a country from other countries around the world. And that's perhaps the biggest impact that PISA has had in the long run, is actually to create that platform for people to question their ideas. And the systems that are moving fastest are the ones that are open to the world, that are open to new ideas, that they're willing to question their practice. The systems that have seen very little improvement are those that are, trapped by their own ways of thinking and unwilling to challenge their beliefs. So it's, there's always specificity in systems, but I really believe there's so much that we can learn from each other, with each other. And in the end, that's motivated me to do this book. In fact, the very specific instance was when I was in Shanghai and saw really the poorest kids, immigrant students coming from the countryside with no past in education, getting into first grade schools, because the system was willing and able to deploy its best teachers in those kinds of migrant schools and gives those students a future. And that's basically when I'm writing, what I'm writing in the book is not making, the impossible possible. No. It's about making the possible attainable, and I really believe we can do a lot better than this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think the iceberg analogy is very interesting, because it sort of really gives that sense of inertia, which I think gets in the way of real change. And I'll pass to the audience, but just one analogy from my part. And as you can probably tell, although I'm in Sydney now, I'm from Ireland, from Dublin. And the part of Dublin I came from in the west of the city, possibly 300 or 400 students sat the high school exam at 17, 18 years of age. That was probably about a third of the age cohort, so itself a very bad result. And of that 200 or 300 students who sat it, 4, maybe 5 went to higher education back in 1988. We had 20 odd years of extraordinary progress economically, admittedly a blip in the middle with a major crash, but back again. And despite all that change in economic fortune and the change in the labour market and the clear change in what students could expect, when I looked recently at the data for the suburb of Dublin I came from, about 4 or 5 students a year went into higher education still. So no matter what, the extraordinary progress is met with extraordinary stickiness and persistence. And that can't just be because of being in the economic doldrums. I mean, in a sense, you have this natural experiment of an economy booming and yet a whole bunch of people who are left behind. And the systemic issues not really being addressed ultimately. So on that front, I'm going to pass to the audience, and I'll do my best to sort of keep order. So I have a question here, and then here, and then I have 2 here. So I'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering what your views were about the French. Sorry, since France is hosting the ministerial this year, I was wondering what your views are about the French public school system. I mean, it seems to be the most completely antiquated, outdated system, and we're seeing a lot of alternative schools trying, private schools, but they're totally unaffordable. So I was wondering what your views are. What is holding France back? Why isn't it changing? It seems to have been the same for the last 150 years. And then in the U.S., I was wondering, like, the higher education system and the way you see it evolving, and this sort of completely outlandish fees. What's going to happen there? Thank you.
Yeah, France is, I think, a classical example of an education system that has been very much captured, by a conservative clientele. Actually, what's holding the system back is probably less teachers and institutions than parents having certain beliefs about, their children's future academic success, revered as the only route for learning, and so on. So these are very powerful gateways that limit, the very creative and innovative ways of working of teachers, and it's hard to change. But at the same time, there are education. Is it better now? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Otherwise, I'll take yours. No. I think that's basically what we need to work on. And higher education, not something I discuss in the book, but I think it's an example in the United States where, the value of tuition that universities extract from students has no relation anymore to the value actually universities add to the lives of people. And that sort of, when those sort of things get decoupled, you run your, and the funding basically is coming from parents and families largely. So actually, this is where, it's no longer the best and brightest getting the best places, but the wealthiest. And I think that's a kind of real risk for the future of education as well.
That's right. The economic return in the US now has reached a point where it can't possibly meet the economic costs of it.
Yeah.
And without a very well-functioning loan system, which I think Australia, for example, has, and all the evidence that we've worked on there suggests that the Australian system is such that the cost of going no longer acts as a barrier for participation. The school system acts as a barrier for participation, but the costs of going aren't, unless you have a system that meets that. And then I'm going to be going this side, and then I'm going to swing back around.
Yes, hello. Hello, can you hear? Yes. I'm Pierre Winnicki, founder of Trust Inside, based in France, a company that designed a model, the Tree of Trust, to objectify, measure, and build trust in the school system in France. My question is, you haven't mentioned the word trust, building trust between parents, teachers, and children, even though in your discussion, the number of issues you've raised tend to deal with trust, in fact. Is this issue of building trust something that you view as important? Is it measured? Is it worked on concretely in your experience in various countries?
Actually, you know, it's a part that I discuss quite extensively in my book, because in a way, trust is the glue that holds together systems. No? If education becomes a management of mistrust, you end up with bureaucracy, with hierarchy, with kind of a top-down accountability, where you actually succeed to build trust. You build strong ties between parents and teachers. You build strong ties within the teaching community. But trust cannot be legislated. That's the hard part of it. It cannot be put in the form of administrative structures. And I mean, our education systems like Finland would be a great example where the whole system is built around trust. There's very little in terms of formal structures, so managed transparency. But the test of truth is only 5% of the student performance variation that lies between schools. Every school succeeds. Why? Because every school knows what every other school is doing, and the government is very good in, you know, attracting the most talented teachers in the most challenging classrooms and linking sort of different pairing schools. And I think that's very important. That's to do with trust. But I give you just a very practical example. You know, if a teacher calls parents when there's a problem in school, that's almost a guarantee where you actually destroy any form of trust. Because as a parent, the moment that happens, you know, okay, I have to defend my child, whatever happened, and so on. If you make that, you know, student-teacher dialogue, parent dialogue, a regular feature of the education system, you invest time and energy, you can build that kind of foundation on which you can actually then develop a child's future. So I actually devote a very significant part of the book to that issue, because I really believe if you don't succeed to, you know, build trust, and not trust which is blind trust, but trust that is actually related to professional competency, I think we can change a lot.
So we have three people here. 1, 2, 3.
Yes,
and then
hello.
I promise.
Jennifer Flock. Some of the comments that you made in your introduction about how what we learned in the past or what we taught in the past aren't necessarily the things that we should be learning or teaching in the future. Those kinds of ideas resonated with me. And I'm wondering concretely how you think the PISA test needs to be adapted to reflect these new skill sets that are so essential for succeeding, for the kids to succeed in the 21st century. So I'm specifically thinking about things like intercultural competency, digital fluency, innovation, et cetera, the kinds of things that people talk about all the time. I'm wondering how you imagine adapting the PISA.
I think it's a very, very important question. Not limited to PISA, you know, the gateways that we construct, the assessments, the exams, have a very powerful ripple-down effect on what we actually do in education, up to early childhood education and care. You know, and in PISA we are working very, very hard to sort of try to adapt the assessment as the world is changing. Intercultural understanding is actually this year's assessment. We call it global competency, but it's basically looking at your capacity to see the world through different lenses and perspectives. Are you willing and able to work with people who think differently from you, who are differently from you? Do you have an understanding of the concept of culture? It's going to be part of the 2018 assessment. In 2021, we're going to look at creative thinking skills. And it's not creativity in its broader sense, that's still beyond the reach of what we can do technically. Creative thinking, we believe we can sort of capture. But the biggest investments currently go into those kind of social and emotional kind of qualities. Some people call it character, but it's basically about, you know, not what we know, but who we are and how we behave and how we relate to other people's empathy, curiosity, courage, leadership. I think we need to find ways to reflect them in the way in which we do assessment. Some parts of education systems are actually doing quite well on this. Vocational education and training is often a lot further advanced than academic learning in school in doing this, but it's a big agenda for PISA, and for me it's the test of truth. If we do not succeed in, you know, making sure that our assessments reflect reality or what is needed, we're holding systems back rather than to advance them. And actually I can say that's been true for PISA from the very beginning, you know, where it's very hard to think back to the year 2000 now. We are so far ahead on this, but in those times many people still talked a lot about content knowledge. There were many people who believed PISA should test the capacity of students to reproduce subject matter content. We didn't go down that route. From the very first day we put the premium on people's capacity to use what they know, to creatively apply knowledge, to transfer knowledge. So we actually gave students the content knowledge in the test, and wanted to see whether they can, bring that to bear. Many people criticize us for this in this time. But, 15 years later, that's the standard. Everybody sort of accepts that the world of schooling really, in the world in which we live today, the world doesn't reward you for what you know. It rewards you for what you can do with what you know. And that Google knows everything.
So first we answer the question about how to fund an education in the US. That's the lack of education and funding education. Basically, I have been a product of the US education system without any debt. So if you are properly educated, you find a way how to educate yourself without getting into debt. And that's where the gap between actual knowledge and the application and actually how to be educated without falling into the debt trap. And my question is, we talk about how teachers should collaborate among other teachers, but we are also forgetting that teachers need to be a forever, like a lifelong interns or like an apprentice with a real life situation. For example, the trends in the job market, the trends in the cutting edge education and the technology. If teachers are just cooped up in their classrooms and they're following the guidelines or the contents and not following through what is coming up in the edge and not building the bridge with the higher education system or the job market, they are actually failing our students to reach to the next level of education. So how do we reform that gap? How do we train our teachers to be the next generation teachers?
Yeah, I think you raise a very, very important point. And in fact, again, I devote a fair part of my book to that question by studying education systems that have become very good at that. If you look at the United States, you're absolutely right. Teachers have very little time and also very little motivation. There's no real career for teachers. Teachers is basically teaching what you've known, what you've learned. But if you go, for example, to Singapore, teachers would typically spend at least 100 hours per year to actually study in professional learning communities with their colleagues. They would go do internships. They would go into research. Every teacher typically, as part of their career, will go or into policy. Actually, if you go to the Ministry of Education in Singapore, you don't find just bureaucrats. There are a lot of teachers working there, and they go back to school or in research as well. So I think we can build those linkages. That's exactly what a professional work organization looks like. You cannot expect your students to become lifelong learners if they do not see their teachers being lifelong learners. I think that also the big potential there is that technology now provides opportunities for co-creation. Actually, students may be ahead of their teachers on certain kinds of ways of thinking and use of technology, and there are wonderful opportunities for teachers actually to become part of that learning experience, to get away from the hierarchy, I as a teacher know everything, you as a student consume what I do, to actually co-creating knowledge. But there are lots of examples around the world where that has happened. What we need to have is the courage to change the work organization, to actually see the teachers as knowledge workers as opposed to kind of industrial kind of workers. But there are really good examples. In Northern Europe, you find them. I think the example of Singapore is a very good example. Let me give you one last sort of a very simple kind of way of how I saw this happening also in Shanghai. They have a digital platform where teachers can upload their lesson plans and projects and ideas and so on. Very simple kind of technical system. But the trick is they combine that with a reputational metric, like we are used to in Facebook or eBay or Amazon. So the more other teachers are going to download your ideas, criticize your ideas, use your lessons, improve your lessons, the more you rise in visibility and status in the education system. And at the end of the school year, your school principal is not only going to ask you, how well did you teach your children, but what contribution did you make to the profession? How did you help your colleagues grow in their professional careers? So there is an incentive and a kind of support system to engage people to be part of a profession, to have collective ownership of professional practice rather than just thinking, I do what I've once learned for my life. But I think you raise a very, very important point. If we do not succeed to build that work organization, education systems are never going to advance. There's no way in a world that is moving as fast as we see today to feed education systems top down with curriculum reform and those kinds of things.
Great. We have a lady here.
Yes, hello, Elizabeth Gauthier. I have a few questions. When you started your introduction, you said education is more about developing your own compass to navigate. Could you just recap on what are the 3 points that seem most important to acquire? And then the second question is the balance between the content, maybe on more technical aspects, and the sort of soft aspects. What sort of percentage balance? And then if you can give just 3 points on how to acquire the more, soft skills elements.
Yeah, all very good questions, very difficult questions. On your first one, how do we build this compass? You ask for 3 points. For me, there would be anticipation, reflection, and action. How do we help young people actually to, what we do often in school, we teach students the truth of our truth. The question is, can we actually enable them to question the established wisdom of our times? Can we help them to be open to the novelty, open to new ideas? Second point is reflection, stepping back, seeing the forest among the trees, taking a critical stance of myself, of others. And last but not least, being able to mobilize my cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something. Now, we know a lot of things, we can do a lot of things, but are we able to mobilize our resources to change things? And that's, I think, the test of truth of that kind of compass. On the balance, it's a very difficult question to answer, but I believe there are actually many opportunities for developing social emotional skills that we currently do not realize. The last thing I would want to see is that we introduce, a subject of character development also in school. But, mathematics is a great context where you can actually teach collaborative skills by having students solve problems collaboratively. Sport is a great subject where you can teach resilience and, courage and empathy and, responsibility for others. So I think we need to make those things more deliberate and more conscious, and I also believe we need to measure those kinds of things. We cannot say to teachers, build, team skills and all of this, and then at the end say, but I'm only going to look at your mathematics performance. And I must tell you, when we, for the very first time, PISA assessed social and emotional skills in 2015, where we looked at collaborative problem-solving skills, one specific element. And it was quite shocking to see that you have only about 8% of students around the industrialized world, advanced countries, where students have a reasonable sense of working with others. The problems that we gave them were actually very simple. All we wanted to see is, can you share your knowledge with your colleagues? Can you develop a joint solution strategy? Can you actually follow through, agree on the kind of conclusions? Simple things to do, what you need in life. Only 8% can do that. We took that for granted, we accepted. If that would happen in mathematics or reading, we would, go out and basically say this. But I think that's about the balance.
Yeah, hi. I run a group of organizations that use participatory theatre for learning, particularly with refugee and immigrant populations. And we're totally at the intersection of social and emotional learning and soft skills. But routinely, the kind of work that we do is devalued. And if you look at a lot of education systems around the world, the arts get cut. They're usually the first thing in the budgets. Yeah. But having literally just come from a session around AI and how we compete, exactly what the kind of work that I and obviously many people do is exactly what we're looking for to compete with AI. So I'd be really interested in your perspective of the role that the arts have in education and what we as practitioners can be doing to impact the education system on that.
And I think it's another good example for how we need to build those social emotional skills that are being developed through the arts as part of the core curriculum rather than seeing them as an add-on. In a way, we say today to students, in the morning we're going to make your life a misery with math and science, and in the afternoon we use arts as a recreation, as a compensation for all of that. We need to look at the arts much more in the sense, how do they foster creative kind of working? How do they foster social skills, In fact, the most transformative educational experience I had, I played in the German youth orchestra. Suddenly you need to listen to other people. You need to play with other people. You're nothing if you don't actually, completely align with the kind of, and I think that's part of the intentional curriculum design process. And but at the moment, it's seen as it's even called an extracurricular activity now.
And final question.
Thank you so much. I'm Laura from Kazakhstan, and last year we here in Kazakhstan started the innovative project with UNESCO on intercultural dialogue online platform and some interactive textbooks for school children. My question is, today, early in the session, we heard Mr. Alvaro Pereira. He was talking about need to invest more in skills, education, and digital infrastructure. My question is regarding to OECD. What kind of earlier you also maybe answered the balance between digital and so-called, let's say, classical part of education could be, as you see, be in the course of OECD resistance.
Yeah, you know, I would view digital technologies as simply the medium of today. Tomorrow there may be something completely different, and the past was something completely different. You know, 50 years ago we didn't teach people pen literacy. So I think we shouldn't really be obsessed with, you know, computer literacy or digital literacy these days. We should ask ourselves, what are the cognitive, social, emotional skills that are really empower us to use the technology of today? For example, in the digital age, you know, it's about innovation, it's about creative thinking, it's about being able to validate knowledge, to question knowledge. You know? These are the kind of cognitive skills that are really, really important. And often in school we get too focused on the, you know, technology of the day. You know, some people say, should we teach 3-year-old children coding? You know, by the time they graduate, they will ask themselves, actually remind me what was coding. You know? Sort of the time moves so fast that we get always trapped by educating people our technology rather than for their future. So I believe the future is really about, you know, the thinking skills that underlie this. Can, for example, when you think about coding, can students, you know, master, you know, computational thinking, algorithmic thinking? Do they know what process and steps are, as opposed, you know, can they program a computer? That's sort of, I think, something people can always pick up. People actually do pick up, but I don't believe that, for example, people born in the digital age are automatically digital natives. In fact, you can see lots of young people today who fundamentally struggle with the tools. You see that in the social media sphere, you see this in the kind of digital news sphere. We need to do a lot better on those kinds of skills as opposed to the kind of technology part.
So is this, I'm hoping that this book isn't a retirement statement. Clearly you and the team have a lot more to do. So maybe in 1 minute it would be good to give us a sense of what's next for the OECD education team.
Yeah, actually, one of the most fascinating initiatives we're in is what we call Education 2030, is actually to paint that horizon of how the future of work, the future of education is going to look like. What are the kind of pedagogies that will help us, you know, build those 21st century skills? It's a great process of reflection, very, very difficult. You know, it's always easier to predict the past than to analyze the future. So, and we are at the OECD in the same trap. You know, most of our data are about the past. And this is a kind of blue sky thinking project that hopefully will help us frame a lot of our work.
A fascinating 45 minutes, I'm sure you'll all agree. Maybe you'll join me in the usual way of thanking Andreas for a stimulating conversation.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for coming.